He wasn't standing at the edge of the frozen lake because he wanted to die. Caleb Ward stood there because he no longer remembered how to live. The Montana wind rolled across the ice in long, hollow breaths, rattling the pine trees behind him like distant whispers in a church he had stopped believing in years ago. Snow crunched softly beneath his boots. Somewhere far across the dark water, a lone owl called once. Then silence swallowed everything again. Caleb tightened his grip around the old white cane in his hand. The plastic handle was cracked near the top from years of use. Like him, worn down slowly, quietly. The world around him existed now only as fragments. Cold air against scarred skin. The smell of pine sap and frozen earth. The faint creak of the wooden dock beneath his feet. 7 years earlier, he had lost his sight during his final deployment overseas. The explosion had taken more than his vision. It had taken color, distance, purpose, the ability to wake up without hearing ghosts breathing beside him in the dark. At 38 years old, Caleb lived alone in a weathered cabin nearly 12 miles outside the nearest town. Most mornings, he sat on the porch listening to truck tires hiss down the highway half a mile away, imagining strangers driving toward families, jobs, places that still needed them. Nobody needed Caleb Ward anymore. Not since the military retirement. Not since the funeral. Not since the phone stopped ringing. The snow thickened around him now, soft flakes drifting onto the shoulders of his old Marine jacket. He could feel moisture gathering in his beard. Somewhere behind him, hidden among the trees, his truck ticked quietly as the engine cooled. Caleb inhaled slowly. The air burned his lungs. He took one careful step closer to the frozen shoreline. Then another. Ice groaned faintly beneath the lake like something ancient shifting in its sleep. Just keep walking, he whispered to himself, though the words sounded empty even to his own ears. His late father used to say that winter in Montana could swallow a man whole without leaving so much as a footprint behind. Tonight, Caleb almost wanted that. No noise. No pity. No hospitals. No more waking up reaching for things he could never see again. He lowered his head. The wind pressed harder against him. And then he heard it. A growl. Low. Deep. Close enough to stop his heartbeat cold. Caleb froze instantly. The sound did not belong to the woods. It was controlled. Intentional. The kind of warning that came from something trained. Snow shifted somewhere behind him. Slow footsteps. Heavy paws pressing through ice and powder. Caleb turned carefully toward the sound, pulse hammering beneath his ribs. The growl came again, softer this time. Not angry. Protective. Then silence. Caleb swallowed hard. Easy, he murmured automatically, old instincts rising through years of darkness. The animal moved closer. He could hear steady breathing now. Calm. Measured. The scent reached him next. Wet fur. Cold air. Leather. And something else beneath it. Smoke. Gun oil. Memory. Caleb's hand trembled slightly at his side. The dog stopped inches away. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, very gently, something brushed against Caleb's frozen hand. Metal. A small object dangling from worn fabric. Caleb frowned and reached down carefully. His fingers closed around a cold police medal hanging from a frayed collar strap. The moment he touched the engraving, the blood drained from his face. Because he knew that name. Officer Nathan Hale. The man who pulled Caleb from a burning convoy overseas before disappearing from his life forever. But Nathan Hale had been dead for 8 years. The wind moved softly through the trees as Caleb stood frozen beside the lake, the small metal trembling in his hand. For a moment, he forgot about the cold, forgot about the ice beneath his boots, forgot about the ache that had followed him every waking day for 7 years. Officer Nathan Hale. Even blind, Caleb could picture the name perfectly. He remembered Nathan's laugh first. Low and rough like gravel under tires. The man had been a military police officer attached to Caleb's convoy unit overseas during Caleb's final deployment. Nathan always carried black coffee in a dented thermos and spoke to everyone like they mattered. Especially the younger Marines. Especially Caleb. Back then, Caleb still had his eyesight. Back then, the world still made sense. A gust of snow swept across the frozen shoreline, pulling Caleb back into the present. The dog remained perfectly still beside him. No barking, no pulling, just breathing quietly against the dark. Caleb slowly lowered himself onto the edge of the old dock, his knees stiff from the cold. The wood creaked beneath his weight. Somewhere close, The dog sat down too. Caleb could hear the faint rustle of thick fur brushing snow. Nathan had a dog, Caleb whispered after a long silence. His voice sounded fragile out there beneath the winter sky. Big shepherd. Smartest animal I ever met. The dog shifted slightly. Caleb swallowed hard. Memories came slowly now, like old photographs surfacing underwater. Nathan used to talk about retiring from service and joining the police department back home in Montana. He wanted quiet roads, fishing trips, a small cabin near the mountains. The kind of life men dream about when they are too tired to dream big anymore. But none of that ever happened. Caleb still remembered the phone call years later. Officer Nathan Hale killed during a police operation outside Billings. No wife, no children, only a retired K-9 partner transferred into state custody afterward. Caleb had never asked what happened to the dog. He regretted that now. Snow settled softly onto Caleb's shoulders while the dog remained beside him like a shadow carved from silence itself. Slowly, carefully, Caleb reached one hand forward. The animal did not pull away. His fingers brushed thick fur first, cold from the storm, then warmth underneath. Solid muscle. Scars. The shepherd's breathing deepened slightly, but stayed calm. Caleb exhaled shakily. "You knew him," he murmured. The dog lowered his head into Caleb's hand without resistance. The simple gesture hit harder than grief ever had. Caleb had spent years avoiding touch, avoiding people. The world became smaller after blindness. Conversations turned awkward. Friends faded one by one. Even kindness began to sound like pity after a while. But this dog asked for nothing. No explanations. No strength. No pretending. Only presence. Somewhere deep in the woods, branches cracked under the weight of snow. The shepherd's ears lifted instantly. Alert. Trained. Caleb felt it through the animal's posture alone. "Still working even now, huh?" he whispered faintly. For the first time in months, something close to a smile touched the corner of his mouth. The dog suddenly stood and stepped closer. Caleb heard the soft jingle of the metal near his collar. Then came another sound, a faint electronic chirp buried beneath the leather strap. Caleb frowned. Carefully, he slid his fingers along the old collar until he found something small attached near the buckle. Plastic, worn smooth by time. A tracking device. Old police issue. Dead battery. Caleb's pulse slowed. "Why would they leave this on you?" he asked quietly. The dog leaned against his leg slightly, as though exhausted from carrying something too long alone. Caleb sat there listening to the frozen world breathe around them. The lake groaned softly beneath its layer of ice. Snow drifted through the pine trees in slow, silver waves. And for the first time in years, Caleb did not feel completely alone inside the dark. Then the dog rose suddenly to his feet again. This time, he gave a single low whine and began walking away from the lake toward the forest trail behind the cabin. After a few steps, he stopped. Waited. Caleb frowned. "You want me to follow you?" The shepherd stood perfectly still in the falling snow, amber eyes fixed on the blind veteran, as if the answer mattered more than either of their lives. Some souls do not ask for help with words. They just keep walking and hope somebody follows. Caleb tightened his grip around the white cane as the German shepherd stood waiting in the falling snow. The dog did not bark again. He simply watched Caleb with the patient stillness of something that had spent years learning how to survive silence. Wind swept through the trees behind the cabin, carrying the scent of pine, frozen dirt, and distant chimney smoke from somewhere miles away. Caleb slowly rose from the dock, joints stiff from cold and age. "All right," he muttered softly. "I am coming." The shepherd turned immediately, paws crunching through fresh snow along the narrow forest trail behind the property. Caleb followed carefully, using the sound of movement ahead to guide him. Every few seconds, the dog slowed just enough for Caleb to keep pace. It felt practiced, intentional, like this was not the first time the animal had guided someone through darkness. The trail curved uphill behind the cabin toward a line of old cedar trees Caleb had not visited in years. Snow brushed against his jacket sleeves as branches swayed overhead. Somewhere nearby, water trickled beneath buried ice. The forest felt alive tonight. Not threatening, just awake. Caleb listened carefully to the rhythm of the dog's footsteps ahead of him. Strong, steady, protective. The same sound had once followed soldiers through ruined villages overseas. Strange how memory worked. A single sound could pull a man backward through time faster than sight ever could. Nathan used to whistle when he got nervous, Caleb said quietly into the cold air. Drove everybody crazy. The shepherd's ears twitched at the name. Caleb noticed instantly. Yeah, he whispered. You remember him too. The dog slowed again until Caleb's hand brushed against thick fur near his shoulder. Warm. Real. Alive. Caleb had spent years speaking only when necessary. Groceries. Gas stations. Doctor appointments. Most conversations died quickly once people realized he could not see their faces. But tonight words came easier somehow. Maybe because the dog never interrupted. Maybe because grief sounded less heavy out here beneath the snow. After several minutes, the shepherd stopped completely. Caleb nearly bumped into him. The forest around them had gone strangely quiet. No wind now. No birds. Only breathing. Caleb tilted his head slightly, listening. Then he heard it. Metal creaking softly somewhere ahead. Old hinges moving in the cold. The dog stepped aside. Caleb reached forward carefully with one hand until his fingers touched rough wood. A small structure. Weathered. Half buried beneath snowdrifts. His fingertips traced along frozen boards and a rusted metal latch. Then realization settled over him slowly. A shed, he murmured. The shepherd gave one quiet huff in response. Caleb frowned. He had lived on this property nearly 6 years and never knew anything stood this far back in the woods. Carefully, he pushed against the door. It groaned open with a tired scrape. Cold air rolled out, carrying the smell of cedar dust, old leather, and something faintly familiar underneath. Gun oil. Caleb's chest tightened instantly. The dog walked inside first. Caleb followed carefully, one hand against the wall. His boots brushed across scattered objects on the wooden floor. A toolbox. A folded tarp. Metal chains hanging somewhere overhead. Then the shepherd stopped again. Caleb heard him lower onto the floor beside something large. Waiting. Slowly, Caleb crouched down and reached forward through the dark. His hand touched fabric first. Thick canvas. Then stitching. Then letters embroidered across the surface. Caleb's breathing caught hard in his throat the moment his fingers traced the name sewn onto the old duffel bag. Nathan Hale. Snow tapped softly against the roof outside while the blind veteran knelt frozen beside the bag his dead friend should never have been able to leave behind. The past does not knock before entering a room. Sometimes it waits quietly in the dark until a broken man is finally ready to touch it again. Caleb stayed frozen beside the old duffel bag while snow whispered softly against the roof of the hidden shed. The German shepherd lay only a few feet away, breathing low and steady against the wooden floorboards. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Caleb slowly ran his fingers across the faded stitching again, just to make certain his hands were not lying to him. Nathan Hale. The letters felt rough beneath his fingertips, worn down by years of weather and silence. Caleb swallowed hard. How did this end up here? He whispered into the dark. The dog gave no answer except the faint sound of his tail brushing once against the floor. Caleb carefully reached for the zipper. Rust crackled softly as he pulled it open inch by inch. A scent drifted out immediately. Old canvas. Cedar dust. Coffee grounds. And beneath all of it, the unmistakable smell of gun oil that every Marine carried home whether they wanted to or not. Caleb closed his eyes instinctively, even though darkness already owned them. Memory hit harder that way sometimes. He reached inside slowly. His fingers brushed folded fabric first. A jacket, then paper, then metal. He pulled out a small thermos with a dent near the lid. Caleb let out a shaky breath the second his thumb traced the dent. No way, he murmured faintly. Nathan dropped this thing off a Humvee outside Kandahar and still refused to replace it. Caleb remembered laughing while Nathan poured burnt coffee into paper cups during freezing desert mornings before patrol. Back when exhaustion still felt temporary. Back when they believed they would all make it home. The shepherd lifted his head slightly as Caleb sat down against the wall of the shed, the old thermos resting in his lap like a ghost returned from another life. The air inside the structure felt colder now. Or maybe it was simply grief settling back into places Caleb had spent years trying to lock shut. Carefully, he reached into the bag again. This time his fingers touched paper edges tied together with a rubber band. Letters. He hesitated, then slowly pulled them free. The paper crackled softly in his hands. Some envelopes felt opened already. Others remained sealed. Caleb brushed one thumb across the front of the top envelope and froze. Because the handwriting was familiar too. Sharp block letters. Military neat. Addressed to him. Sergeant Caleb Ward. Caleb's breathing became uneven. Nathan, he whispered. The shepherd stood and moved closer immediately, nails clicking softly against old wood. Caleb felt the dog press against his shoulder just enough to steady him. The simple contact nearly broke him apart. No human had touched him with that kind of quiet understanding in years. Caleb lowered his head. I never answered your last calls, he admitted softly into the dark. After the hospital, I just disappeared. The confession lingered between the cedar walls like smoke. Outside, wind moved through the pine trees in long, mournful breaths. The shepherd remained beside him, silent and watchful. Caleb slowly opened the first letter with trembling hands. He could not see the words anymore, but memory supplied Nathan's voice anyway. Warm, calm, steady. Caleb almost laughed at the cruelness of it. Blindness had taken faces first, then roads, then stars. But somehow grief still remembered voices perfectly. He held the paper carefully against his chest. You kept these? He asked the dog quietly. The shepherd lowered himself beside Caleb's leg again. His breathing slowed. Trusting. Tired. Caleb finally understood something then. This was never random. The dog had not wandered to the lake by accident. He had searched. Maybe for weeks. Maybe longer. Searching for the one person left who still remembered Nathan Hale as more than a name carved into stone. Caleb leaned back against the cold wooden wall while snowstorm winds deepened outside. Somewhere beyond the shed, the forest groaned beneath winter weight. But inside, for the first time in years, the silence around Caleb no longer felt empty. Then suddenly the shepherd's ears lifted sharply toward the door. A low rumble vibrated deep in his chest. Not fear. Warning. Caleb stiffened instantly. Through the storm outside, faint and distant, came the sound of tires crunching slowly across the snow near the cabin. Some nights, the past does not stay buried. It drives back through the snow looking for what was left behind. Caleb slowly lifted his head as the sound of tires rolled faintly through the storm outside the shed. The German shepherd had already risen to his feet beside him, body rigid now, ears sharp toward the forest trail. A low growl vibrated through the cold wooden room. Caleb immediately recognized the difference in the sound. This was not fear. This was protection. Snow hissed softly against the roof while the distant engine idled somewhere near the cabin. Caleb carefully folded Nathan's letters back together with trembling hands and slid them into his jacket pocket. His pulse had started hammering again for reasons he could not explain. Nobody visited this property. Not in winter. Not this late at night. Easy, he whispered toward the dog, though his own voice sounded unsteady. The shepherd did not relax. Caleb pushed himself upright slowly, one hand brushing the old wall for balance. Years ago, his body would have moved faster, stronger, but cold weather stiffened the old injuries now. His left knee still ached whenever snowstorms rolled in from the mountains. The dog stepped closer instantly, as if sensing the hesitation. Caleb rested one hand briefly against the shepherd's neck. Warm fur, steady heartbeat. Strange how quickly trust could grow between two wounded things. Outside, a truck door slammed shut somewhere near the cabin. Then silence. Caleb listened carefully. Snow muffled most sounds, but years in the military had trained him to hear what mattered. Heavy boots. Slow steps. One person only. The shepherd moved toward the shed door without waiting for command. Caleb followed carefully behind him, gripping the white cane in one hand while icy air leaked through the cracks in the old boards. The moment the door opened, winter rushed inside, sharp and bitter against his skin. The shepherd stepped out first into the snow-covered clearing behind the cabin. Caleb followed more slowly, boots sinking several inches into fresh powder. The forest had gone still again. No wind now, just falling snow beneath a sky Caleb could no longer see. Somewhere ahead, near the cabin porch, a man cleared his throat. Caleb Ward. The voice sounded older. Careful, not hostile. Caleb tightened slightly anyway. Who was asking? Snow crunched softly as the stranger approached a little closer, but stopped at a respectful distance. Name is Walter Grayson, the man answered. Retired sheriff out of Billings County. Caleb's brow furrowed instantly. Beside him, the shepherd remained perfectly alert. I tracked the dog here, Walter continued quietly. Been looking for him nearly 3 months. Caleb felt the dog stiffen beside his leg. His name is Shadow, right? Silence hung in the snowy dark for a moment before Walter answered softly. Yeah, that is him. Caleb lowered his head slightly. Shadow. Somehow the name fit perfectly. The retired sheriff let out a tired breath that clouded into the winter air. Most folks gave up on that dog after Nathan passed, he said quietly. Would not eat. Would not obey handlers. Tore through fences twice, trying to escape the K-9 facility. Caleb said nothing. He only rested his hand against Shadow's shoulder while snow gathered slowly across both of them. Walter continued speaking carefully, like a man carrying guilt too long. After the state retired him, they planned to move him again. Different shelters, different trainers. Nothing worked. The old sheriff paused. Then 3 months ago, Shadow disappeared during transport. Caleb's chest tightened slightly. And he came here? No, Walter answered softly. First, he went to Nathan's grave every night for almost 2 weeks. The words landed heavy in the cold air. Shadow lowered his head slightly at the sound of Nathan's name. Caleb felt it immediately. Grief recognized grief faster than anything else on earth. Walter's boots shifted in the snow. Then one morning the dog vanished again. Nobody could figure out why. Caleb swallowed hard. Slowly, realization settled into place inside him. He was looking for me, he whispered. The old sheriff exhaled quietly. Looks that way. Snow continued falling around the three of them, while the dark forest listened in silence. Then Walter spoke again, voice lower this time. There is something else you need to know about Nathan Hale. Shadow immediately lifted his head. The hardest truths arrive quietly, usually in the middle of snowstorms when there is nowhere left to run from them. Caleb stood motionless beside Shadow while cold wind drifted through the trees around the cabin. Across the clearing, retired Sheriff Walter Grayson removed his gloves slowly, like a man preparing to carry something heavy back into the light. Snowflakes clung to the shoulders of his old canvas coat. Nathan never stopped looking for you after the hospital, Walter said softly. Caleb felt the words hit somewhere deep beneath his ribs. The old sheriff took a slow breath before continuing. After you disappeared from the rehabilitation center, he spent nearly 2 years trying to track you down. Called military contacts, veteran programs, even shelters. Caleb lowered his head slightly. Snow melted against his beard before freezing again in the cold. He had vanished on purpose after losing his sight. Changed states. Ignored calls. Stopped answering letters. It felt easier back then to disappear than let people watch him fall apart piece by piece. Walter's voice remained calm beneath the hush of the storm. Nathan blamed himself for what happened overseas. Said if he had reached your convoy 30 seconds earlier, maybe things would have turned out different. Caleb closed his eyes instinctively. He could still hear the sound of Nathan shouting through smoke all those years ago. Could still feel rough hands dragging him towards safety while the world burned white around him. It was not his fault, Caleb whispered hoarsely. I know that now. Shadow pressed gently against Caleb's leg as though sensing the fracture in his voice. The dog had not taken his eyes off him once. Walter nodded slowly somewhere in the dark. Nathan knew that too. Eventually, snow shifted beneath the sheriff's boots as he stepped slightly closer. But there is one thing he never gave up on. Caleb lifted his head. Walter hesitated for a moment before speaking again. You. Silence settled over the clearing. Deep. Heavy. Honest. Caleb could hear the distant creaking of pine branches bending under ice somewhere high above them. The smell of chimney smoke drifted faintly through the forest from the cabin. Warmth waiting somewhere nearby. Yet Caleb suddenly felt colder than before. Before Nathan died, Walter continued quietly. He left instructions with the department. Caleb frowned slightly. Instructions? About Shadow. The shepherd's ears twitched at the sound of his name. Walter exhaled slowly into the frozen air. Nathan said if anything ever happened to him, the dog belonged with Caleb Ward. Caleb's breath caught hard in his throat. For a second, he forgot about the snow. Forgot about the cold biting his hands numb. What? Walter nodded once. Your name was written directly into Nathan's service paperwork. Emergency transfer request. Caleb shook his head slowly like the truth itself hurt to hold. That makes no sense. I had not spoken to him in years. Walter's answer came softly. Some people do not stop loving their brothers just because the phone goes quiet. The words nearly broke something open inside Caleb that had stayed sealed shut for a very long time. Shadow suddenly stepped forward and rested his head gently against Caleb's chest. Not trained, not commanded, just there. Caleb's fingers buried slowly into the thick fur around the dog's neck. Warmth spread through his frozen hands. Real warmth. Human beings had spent years telling Caleb he needed counseling, time, healing, but none of them understood the silence veterans carried home, the kind too deep for ordinary conversation. Yet somehow this old shepherd understood it without a single word. Walter cleared his throat softly. "There is more inside that shed," he said. "Nathan kept things there after he bought the property next to yours." Caleb stiffened slightly. "Next to mine?" "He bought the land 2 years before he passed." Walter's voice lowered. "Planned to surprise you if he ever found you again." Snow continued falling around them in slow white silence, while Caleb stood there unable to speak. Somewhere deep beneath grief, something fragile stirred for the first time in years. Not happiness, not peace, just the faint painful feeling that maybe he had not been forgotten after all. Grief changes shape when you realize somebody loved you quietly the entire time. Caleb stood in the falling snow with one hand buried in Shadow's thick fur, while the truth settled slowly into his chest like thawing ice. Nathan Hale had bought the neighboring land years ago, built a hidden shed in the woods, kept letters Caleb never answered, and somehow, even after death, had still found a way to send his dog back to him. The thought hurt more than loneliness ever had. Walter Grayson shifted his weight beside the truck near the cabin driveway, boots crunching softly in fresh powder. "Storm is getting worse," the old sheriff said gently. "You should get inside before the roads freeze solid." Caleb nodded faintly, but did not move right away. Shadow remained pressed against his side, calm now, watchful beneath the dim glow spilling from the cabin porch light. Snow gathered across the shepherd's dark coat in soft white flecks. Caleb slowly exhaled into the freezing night air. "He waited for me," he whispered. Walter answered quietly. "Looks like both of them did." The words lingered in the storm between the 3 men. One living, one gone. One who spoke only through loyalty and silence. A few minutes later, Caleb guided himself carefully back toward the cabin porch, while Shadow walked close enough for their shoulders to brush. Walter followed behind, carrying Nathan's old duffel bag from the shed. The wooden steps groaned softly beneath their boots as they entered the small cabin. Warm air wrapped around them immediately, carrying the scent of cedar smoke and black coffee left untouched on the counter from earlier that evening. Caleb paused just inside the doorway. The silence inside no longer felt hollow tonight. Shadow stepped into the cabin slowly, nails clicking against old pine floors. He stopped near the fireplace and looked around carefully as if recognizing something. Caleb frowned slightly. "He has been here before," Walter said from behind him. Caleb turned his head. "What?" The old sheriff set the duffel bag gently beside the couch. "Nathan used to bring him out here sometimes while he was building the shed." Caleb ran one hand slowly across the kitchen counter, grounding himself in the familiar edges of home, while unfamiliar emotions moved through him like weather. Home. Strange word. For years this cabin had only been a place to disappear quietly, a place where nobody expected anything from him anymore. But tonight the rooms felt different somehow. Fuller. Shadow walked slowly through the cabin before finally lowering himself near the stone fireplace with a long, exhausted sigh. Caleb listened to the sound carefully. The shepherd sounded tired in a way deeper than age, like an animal that had carried responsibility too long alone. Walter removed his coat near the door. "I should head back before the highway closes," he said gently. Then his voice softened. "But there is something else Nathan left." Caleb stiffened slightly. Walter reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small brass key. Safety deposit box in Billings. He placed the key carefully into Caleb's hand. Cold metal. Worn edges. Nathan renewed the rental every year after he passed. Paid anonymously through a trust. Caleb frowned deeply. Why would somebody do that? Walter's answer came almost immediately. Because he believed someday you would come back. Silence filled the cabin again except for the crackling firewood and the soft breathing of the old police dog near the hearth. Caleb wrapped trembling fingers around the key while emotions he had buried for years pushed dangerously close to the surface. He had spent so long believing he was forgotten, left behind by time, by war, by everybody who once knew his name. Yet somehow one man had continued preparing a place for him long after death itself should have ended the story. Walter moved toward the door slowly. "Get some sleep if you can," he said. "Shadow trusts you. That matters." Caleb nodded faintly. Thank you for bringing him here. The old sheriff looked toward the shepherd lying beside the fire. Truth is, Walter said quietly, I think he brought himself. Then the door closed softly behind him, leaving Caleb alone with the dog and the storm outside. For a long time neither of them moved. Wind rattled faintly against the cabin windows while firelight crackled softly through the dark room. Caleb finally lowered himself carefully onto the floor beside Shadow. The shepherd immediately lifted his head and rested it across Caleb's knee without hesitation. Warm, heavy, trusting. Caleb stared blindly toward the fire while one trembling hand moved slowly through the thick fur around Shadow's ears. You found me, he whispered. Shadow closed his eyes, and for the first time in 7 years, Caleb Ward did not feel invisible anymore. Morning arrived quietly over the mountains, like Mercy afraid to make too much noise. Snowlight filtered through the cabin windows in pale silver bands while the fire inside had burned low to glowing embers. Caleb woke slowly in the old armchair beside the hearth, stiff blankets draped across his chest. For a few seconds he forgot where he was. Then he heard breathing nearby. Deep, steady, familiar already. Shadow lay stretched across the rug beside him, one paw resting near Caleb's boots as though guarding the room even in sleep. Caleb listened carefully to the soft sounds of the cabin waking around him. Wind brushing the porch, wood settling in the walls. The faint hiss of the coffee maker timer clicking on in the kitchen. Simple things. Human things. Things he had stopped noticing years ago. Slowly, Caleb leaned forward and rested one hand against Shadow's neck. Warm fur met cold fingers instantly. The shepherd opened his eyes but did not move away. He simply looked up at Caleb with the calm patience of an old soul who already understood pain too well. Morning, Caleb whispered. Shadow's tail brushed softly against the floor once. The sound made something shift gently inside Caleb's chest. It felt unfamiliar, almost dangerous. Hope often did. Outside, the storm had passed during the night. Fresh snow blanketed the mountains in perfect silence nearly 2 feet deep across the property. Caleb could smell the sharp, clean cold drifting through tiny cracks around the cabin door. He slowly stood, joints aching, and made his way toward the kitchen counter while Shadow followed close behind without command. Every few steps, Caleb felt the dog lightly brush against his leg, adjusting to his pace automatically. Guiding him, Caleb paused near the sink. You already know how to do this, do you? He murmured faintly. Shadow remained beside him, alert and still. Caleb smiled slightly before reaching for 2 coffee mugs from the cabinet by memory. One for himself. Then he stopped halfway. The second mug had become habit years ago before loneliness took over the cabin completely. Slowly, Caleb set it back down. But moments later, he heard Shadow rise and cross the kitchen floor. The shepherd nudged something gently against Caleb's boot. Caleb frowned and bent carefully. His fingers brushed ceramic. The second mug. Shadow had pushed it back toward him. Caleb froze completely. Then a rough laugh escaped his throat before he could stop it. Quiet. Rusted from disuse. Real. All right, he whispered, voice cracking slightly. 2 mugs it is. Sunlight slowly strengthened outside, while steam curled upward from fresh coffee, filling the small cabin with warmth and memory. Caleb sat at the kitchen table with Shadow lying beside his chair, one hand resting absently on the shepherd's back. For the first time in years, silence no longer felt like punishment. It felt shared. After breakfast, Caleb carefully removed the bundle of letters from his jacket pocket and placed them on the table. The paper still smelled faintly of cedar and old dust from the hidden shed. Shadow immediately lifted his head the moment the letters touched the wood. Caleb ran one thumb slowly across the top envelope again. I cannot read these anymore, he admitted softly into the quiet room. Saying it aloud still hurt sometimes. Not because of pride, because reading had once been how he escaped loneliness. Maps, novels, letters from brothers overseas. All gone dark now. Shadow stood and moved closer beside him. Caleb felt the dog rest his chin gently against Caleb's arm. Warm, present. Caleb swallowed hard. Nathan kept writing anyway, he whispered. Tears threatened suddenly without warning. He hated how grief did that. Arrived quietly through ordinary moments. Not battlefields. Not funerals. Coffee mugs. Dog fur. Old letters nobody stopped sending. Caleb lowered his head while one tear slipped silently into his beard. Shadow stayed perfectly still beside him. No barking, no panic, just companionship steady enough to hold broken things together. After a long silence, Caleb finally reached toward the counter where his old answering machine sat untouched beneath months of dust. Very slowly, he pressed the blinking button he had ignored for nearly 3 weeks. Static crackled softly through the cabin speaker. Then came a familiar voice from the past. Warm, calm, unmistakable. Hey Caleb, it is Nathan again. Just checking in, brother. Caleb stopped breathing. Beside him, Shadow lifted his head immediately at the sound of his old partner's voice filling the cabin once more. Some voices do not disappear when a person dies. They linger in old machines, in quiet rooms, in the hearts of those who were not ready to lose them. Caleb sat frozen at the kitchen table while Nathan Hale's voice crackled softly through the dusty answering machine. Shadow had moved closer instantly, ears lifted high, amber eyes fixed toward the speaker like he was hearing a ghost come home. I know you probably will not answer. Nathan's recorded voice continued warmly. But if you ever hear this, just know none of this changed who you are, brother. Caleb's hand trembled against the edge of the table. Outside, morning sunlight glowed pale across the snow-covered mountains while smoke curled lazily from the cabin chimney into the cold Montana sky. The world kept moving. But inside the cabin, time had stopped. Nathan's voice carried the same steady calm Caleb remembered from overseas. The kind of voice that could cut through panic without ever raising itself. I talked to Shadow again today. The recording continued with a faint, tired laugh. He still checks the front door every night like you might walk through it. Caleb lowered his head as emotion tightened painfully in his chest. Beside him, Shadow slowly rested his head across Caleb's knee again the moment Nathan said his name. Listen to me, Nathan's voice said softly through the static. You are still here for a reason. I know darkness feels permanent right now. I know losing your sight probably feels like losing yourself. But it is not the end. Caleb closed his eyes while tears slipped quietly down his face. No one had spoken to him like that in years. Not carefully. Not honestly. People usually offered sympathy now. Encouragement wrapped in polite distance. But Nathan had spoken to him like a brother who understood suffering without fearing it. The message crackled briefly before continuing. If Shadow ever finds you again someday, trust him. He sees things people miss. Caleb let out a broken breath at those words. Shadow shifted closer immediately, pressing warmly against his leg. The old shepherd's fur smelled faintly of snow and cedar smoke. Safe smells. Living smells. And Caleb, Nathan's voice whispered softly through the speaker. Do not spend your whole life hiding because you got hurt. Some men survive for a reason. Then silence filled the cabin. Only the crackling fireplace remained. Caleb sat motionless while the weight of the message settled slowly through every empty place inside him. Shadow stayed beside him without moving. Loyal even to silence. Loyal even to grief. After a long time, Caleb finally reached down and wrapped both arms carefully around the shepherd's neck. Shadow leaned into him instantly, calm and steady beneath trembling hands. Caleb buried his face into the thick fur around the dog's shoulder while years of loneliness finally cracked open in the quiet warmth of the cabin. No speeches, no dramatic collapse. Just a broken veteran holding the last living piece of someone who never stopped believing he could heal. Outside, sunlight spread slowly across the frozen lake where Caleb had nearly disappeared the night before. The ice glimmered softly beneath the morning sky now, bright and untouched. A new day standing exactly where despair had stood only hours earlier. Caleb slowly lifted his head and wiped his eyes with shaking fingers. Then he reached toward the kitchen counter and picked up the brass key Nathan left behind. Cold metal warmed slowly in his palm. Shadow watched him carefully. Caleb exhaled long and slow before resting one hand against the dog's head. Looks like we have somewhere to go, he whispered. Shadow's tail brushed softly against the floorboards. And somewhere beyond the snow-covered mountains, beyond the years of silence and grief and darkness, life began moving toward them again one quiet step at a time.